My name is William Tecumseh Sherman, and this is my story. I was born on February 8th, 1820, in Lancaster, Ohio. The house that I came into was a modest one, built by a father whose ambition stretched far beyond what his circumstances could hold. My father, Charles Sherman, was a prominent lawyer and Ohio Supreme Court judge, but his early death in 1829 at the age of 39 left our family in turmoil. I was just 9 years old, and the world that had seemed so solid and secure was suddenly cast into disarray. I've often reflected on how my life might have turned out if my father had lived longer, but as is the case with all of us, the path I walked was shaped by loss as much as it was by hope. The death of my father plunged my family into financial instability. My mother, Mary Sherman, was left to raise her 7 children with limited means. She did so with a strength that I would only fully come to appreciate as I grew older. She was the backbone of our family, steering us through the roughest of times. I remember her unwavering resolve to see us all educated, even when resources were scarce. The loss of my father also meant the loss of the familial financial support that might have afforded me a different life. But my mother and I were determined. I often found solace in books and the lessons they carried, and from an early age I felt an innate drive to understand the world more deeply. I was especially drawn to military history and the grandeur of leaders who had shaped the world through strength and strategy. I don't know if my fascination with the military came from my father's influence or from the stories of generals and battles I'd read in books, but it became a driving force that would define my future. When I was about 14, my mother arranged for me to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point. She had connections through my father's network of friends, and although the family couldn't afford the costs of my education, she was able to get me appointed to the academy, which was funded by the government. That was one of the pivotal moments in my life. I think of it now as both an opportunity and a challenge that would ultimately test my abilities, my character, and my resilience. I learned quickly that military life at West Point was as much about endurance as it was about intellect. The days were long, the training rigorous, but it wasn't only the physical and academic rigor that I had to contend with. There were elements of discipline that were meant to break you, to push you to your limits. Some of my classmates thrived under this system, while others struggled. I think I fell somewhere in between. I never was the star of the class, but I kept my head down, focused on what I needed to do, and carried on. When it came time for graduation in 1840, I ranked 6th out of a class of 42. It wasn't a bad rank, but it wasn't at the top either. Still, it was enough to secure my place in the Army, a position I would hold for the next several decades. I'll admit, at the time, I wasn't entirely sure of my future. My education had been thorough, but I lacked a sense of direction. West Point had prepared me for military service, but there was a part of me that wasn't convinced I was ready to embrace it wholeheartedly. I had seen firsthand how the military could be both a noble profession and a soul-crushing one. My classmates at West Point were a mix of idealists, pragmatists, and skeptics, each of us having our own reasons for entering the academy. Some were determined to follow in the footsteps of family members who had served, while others, like me, saw it as a means to a future. It was a time of change in my life, a period when I was still forming my identity, learning who I was and who I could become. I had great aspirations, but those aspirations were still wrapped in uncertainty. I would come to realize that the coming years would test my strength and convictions in ways I never imagined. Looking back, I see how formative those years at West Point were. The foundations of my character were being built then, not through military drills or lectures, but through the relationships I formed with others. The friendships I made in those years would become crucial to my success in later life, and I would carry the lessons learned during that time into my military career. It was there, amid the strict discipline and relentless challenges, that I learned to never give up, to push through even when doubt seemed to overwhelm me. I often think of my time at West Point as a prologue, the first steps in a journey that would span decades. It wasn't the happiest time in my life, but it was the most transformative. It shaped me into the man I was becoming, and it prepared me for the hardships I would face on the battlefield. From the moment I graduated, I knew my life would never be the same. The world outside West Point was vast and uncertain, but it was also full of promise. And I was ready, even if I didn't fully understand the scope of what lay ahead. When I graduated from West Point in 1840, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. At the time, I didn't fully understand what the military career would mean for me. I had just completed a grueling education at one of the most prestigious military academies in the world, yet I felt like a man standing at the edge of an unknown abyss. My youth, my inexperience, and my own inner doubts hung over me like a storm cloud. I was assigned to a regiment in South Carolina, where I would begin my military service. The first years of my military career were, in many ways, uneventful. I was stationed at various posts, learning the ins and outs of military life, adjusting to the routines, and struggling with the rigidity of it all. I was still young, and the weight of the uniform, the daily discipline, and the slow pace of life in the military sometimes felt stifling. I had hoped for a more dynamic role, but I was tasked with routine duties like escorting supply convoys and overseeing small garrisons. For a time, I wondered whether I had made a mistake in choosing this path. I found it hard to reconcile my youthful ideals with the reality of a soldier's life, but I did my best to stay focused. I wasn't one to complain. If anything, I used those early years to observe the officers around me, to learn from them. I saw how the older, more seasoned officers carried themselves, some with quiet confidence, others with arrogance or a sense of entitlement. I learned, as I always did, that each man's approach to leadership was shaped by his own personality and experiences. Some I admired, while others, frankly, I found disappointing. It wasn't long before I became deeply frustrated with the inefficiencies I saw in the Army, the lack of real engagement or the challenge. I wanted more, something more meaningful than the mundane tasks I was assigned. Then, in 1846, the Mexican-American War broke out. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the chance to prove myself in the heat of battle, to fulfill the promise of a military career that had seemed so distant during those early years. The war had been brewing for some time, and it wasn't long before I found myself stationed with the 3rd U.S. Infantry in Florida, preparing for the campaign. The first battles of the Mexican-American War were chaotic and brutal, a far cry from the drills and parades that had filled the early years of my career. The U.S. Army was in many ways unprepared for the challenges of warfare in Mexico's harsh terrain. But I was determined to make a name for myself, and I believed that this war, with its many challenges, could provide the platform for me to do so. My experiences in the Mexican-American War were both eye-opening and humbling. I was part of a series of engagements, primarily in the northern Mexican states, and I quickly realized how ill-prepared the Army was. The conditions were harsh, the heat unbearable, and the Mexican forces, while smaller in number, were skilled and determined. It was during this time that I began to feel the weight of leadership and the responsibility that came with it. At the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847, I was given a greater role in coordinating my unit's movements. Though my involvement wasn't as high profile as some of the officers, I began to appreciate the complexities of battle, the unpredictability of war, and the need for careful planning. Even as the battle raged around me, I found myself thinking strategically, constantly analyzing the situation and looking for ways to gain an advantage. The victory at Buena Vista was a crucial turning point in the war, and while I didn't receive the accolades some of my peers did, I knew that I had proven my value as an officer. I had learned how to think on my feet, how to stay calm under fire, and how to lead men through the chaos of battle. The war provided a wealth of experiences, some of which I would carry with me for the rest of my career. As the war came to an end in 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, I returned to the United States. Though the war had been a victory for the U.S., it left me with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was proud to have played a role in a successful campaign. On the other hand, I had seen firsthand the ravages of war, the destruction, the suffering, and the toll it took on everyone involved. I had learned to respect the costs of warfare in ways I never had before. I had also come to understand that battle was not about glory or honor. It was about survival, strategy, and the ability to make tough decisions under extreme pressure. Despite the success of the Mexican-American War, the next several years of my military career were marked by frustration. After the war, I was reassigned to various posts, none of which held the same sense of excitement or challenge as the campaigns in Mexico. I was stationed at a fort in California where life seemed stagnant. I found myself growing increasingly restless, longing for something more. I struggled with the monotonous routine of garrison life, and a distance from family and friends only heightened my sense of isolation. It was during this period of frustration that I began to question whether the military was truly my calling. I had signed up for a life of action and purpose, but instead I found myself bogged down by bureaucracy and the slow pace of peacetime military life. In 1853, after years of stagnation, I resigned my commission in the Army. It was a difficult decision, one that I felt was necessary in order to pursue something more fulfilling. I had served for over a decade, and though my experiences had been valuable, I was ready for a new chapter. I left the Army and tried my hand at civilian life. After I resigned my commission in the Army in 1853, I thought I had left the military behind for good. In hindsight, it seems almost laughable that I ever thought that. I was eager to try my hand at civilian life, seeking a new path that would give me a sense of purpose and fulfillment. The military, after all, had not been everything I hoped it would be during the peacetime years. But, as I would soon learn, civilian life was not the escape I imagined it to be. My first venture into civilian life was as a banker. I took a position with a bank in San Francisco, hoping that this would be a fresh start. The city was booming with the excitement of the gold rush, and I thought that perhaps this world of finance and commerce would suit me. But I quickly discovered that the world of banking was not my calling. I lacked the patience for the intricacies of finance, and my temperament was not well suited to the speculative nature of banking. Within a year, I found myself frustrated and bored. It wasn't long before I left San Francisco and moved to New York City, hoping that a change of scenery would bring new opportunities. In New York, I worked briefly as a lawyer. The idea of practicing law intrigued me, but like banking, it wasn't the right fit for me. The work felt cold, detached from any sense of greater purpose. I spent my days poring over legal documents and attending to cases that seemed trivial compared to the experiences I had endured in the military. I had once believed that this would be a meaningful career, but after some time, I came to the painful realization that I was simply not cut out for it. But even as I struggled with these civilian careers, there was still a part of me that longed for the military life. The years I had spent as an officer had taught me discipline, structure, and leadership. It was in the military that I had found my true sense of identity. Yet I was reluctant to return to it, at least not in the same capacity. The years of peacetime service had left a bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't just the routine that wore me down, but the sense of purposelessness that seemed to pervade the Army in times of peace. My frustrations with civilian life led me to a final attempt to make something of myself outside the military. I took a position as the superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy, now Louisiana State University. It was a military academy, and in many ways it felt like a return to the discipline of the Army, but I wasn't quite ready to re-enter the life I had left behind. At the academy, I tried to impart what I had learned from my military experiences, passing on my knowledge to young men who were eager to learn. But I quickly grew disillusioned with my role there. The institution was struggling financially, and the administration was inefficient. Even with my best efforts, I saw that it would be difficult to make the academy a success. Again, I found myself yearning for something more, something that gave me a greater sense of purpose. During these years of frustration, I also dealt with personal struggles. My family was a constant source of both support and tension. My mother, ever the strong figure in my life, encouraged me to make something of myself, but the reality of my situation weighed heavily on me. I was supporting my wife, Ellen, and our growing family, and I felt the responsibility of providing for them. At times, it seemed as though my dreams were slipping further and further away. My financial situation was unstable, and I struggled to find a way to reconcile my personal responsibilities with my longing for a meaningful career. As the 1850s wore on, the political landscape of the United States grew more divided. The issue of slavery was beginning to tear at the fabric of the nation, and I watched with growing concern as the country moved closer and closer to a breaking point. In my own life, I had long held views that were decidedly anti-slavery, and as the political climate became more charged, I found myself becoming more vocal in my opposition to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. It was clear to me that the country was heading towards some kind of reckoning, though I didn't yet understand the magnitude of that conflict. I remember the personal toll this period took on me. I was not one for idle chatter or public debate, but the country was on the verge of collapse, and the realities of my own financial struggles made it hard to focus on anything but my own survival. I had briefly found success as an educator, but even that seemed to slip through my fingers as the years passed. By 1860, I had nearly resigned myself to the idea that I would never again find a place for myself in the military. I was too much of a realist to continue clinging to the hope that I would one day return to my former life as an officer. Yet, deep down, I knew that the military had shaped me in ways that no civilian career ever could. It had given me the structure I needed, the clarity of purpose, and the belief in my own capacity to lead. Even in the midst of my struggle, I longed for a sense of direction, a mission that was larger than the small mundane battles I fought in civilian life. It wasn't until the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the secession of Southern states that I was once again called to service. The division between the North and South had finally reached a breaking point, and I knew that the country was on the brink of civil war. It was a time of deep personal and national crisis, but it was also a time of reckoning for me. The years of frustration, of feeling directionless, would give way to a purpose that was greater than any of my earlier ambitions. The country needed men who could lead with clarity, with determination, and with a deep understanding of the stakes. I was ready to answer that call, despite the doubts I had carried with me through the years. The war that had been building for decades was about to begin, and I, too, was about to begin a new chapter. The year 1861 was one of those rare moments in history when everything shifts, when the world seems to change overnight. I watched as the United States began to unravel. The election of Abraham Lincoln had ignited the long-simmering tensions between the North and South, and with the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Civil War officially began. I remember the sense of inevitability in the air, a feeling that everything I had lived through, all the personal struggles, the frustrations with civilian life, had somehow led to this moment. It was clear to me that the time had come to pick a side, and I had no hesitation in doing so. Though I had spent the better part of a decade in civilian life, I knew that I had never truly left the military behind. It was part of me, deep in my bones. When the war broke out, I didn't hesitate to offer my services to the Union cause. I was appointed to the rank of Brigadier General of Volunteers and was placed in charge of the 13th U.S. Infantry Regiment. I was eager, yes, but there was also a sense of nervousness in my heart. I hadn't seen real combat in over a decade, and now I was thrust into the heart of a national conflict that would define the future of this country. The early days of the war were a whirlwind of chaos. There was a sense of urgency everywhere. In Washington, in the field, in the hearts of the soldiers. Everyone was trying to find their footing, trying to make sense of a war that seemed to be spiraling out of control. I was placed in charge of a small, largely untested unit, and I immediately saw the challenges ahead. The Army was poorly organized, undertrained, and ill-equipped to fight a war of this scale. I had seen the way an army could flounder without proper leadership, and now, as a general, I had to rise to the occasion. My first major experience with the chaos of war came at the Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, in July 1861. I had been assigned to help reinforce the Union forces that were fighting the Confederates just outside Washington, D.C. What I encountered on the battlefield was nothing short of disastrous. The Union forces, disorganized and unprepared, were thrown into disarray, and the Confederate troops, though less numerous, fought with great determination. I watched as the Union Army, the army I had joined to support, was driven from the field in humiliating defeat. It was a sobering experience. I remember feeling a sense of disbelief as the chaos unfolded before my eyes. Here I was, a general in a war that I had long believed would be necessary to preserve the Union. Yet we were being driven back by an enemy that seemed far more prepared and resolute than I had imagined. The defeat was not just a military setback, it was a national humiliation. And as I stood there, witnessing the retreat of our forces, I could not help but feel the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. The war had just begun, and already it felt as though everything was unraveling. After that defeat, I was reassigned to the Western theater of the war, a region that would soon become the site of some of the most brutal and decisive campaigns of the conflict. I found myself serving under General Ulysses S. Grant, a man who would come to define the Union's military strategy. I remember the first time I met Grant. He was not an imposing figure, certainly not like the military leaders I had read about as a young man. But there was something in his quiet determination, in his demeanor, that impressed me. He was a man who didn't waste words and didn't seem to care about the trappings of authority. He just wanted to win, and that was something I could respect. Grant's leadership was different from what I had experienced in the East. There were no grand speeches, no pomp and circumstance, just a relentless drive to achieve military objectives. It was under his command that I began to truly understand the scope of this war and the kind of leadership it would require. He didn't believe in grandiose tactics or elaborate plans. Instead, he believed in hard, relentless action. His style of leadership suited me well. I had always been a man who believed in the practical over the theoretical, and Grant's straightforward approach resonated deeply with me. In early 1862, after I had joined Grant in the West, we faced one of the most brutal battles of my career, the Battle of Shiloh. The fight, which took place in Tennessee, remains one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. It was a battle that would challenge every part of me, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The Confederate forces attacked early in the morning, catching our forces off guard. For a while, it seemed as though we might lose the battle entirely. Our troops were caught in a violent and chaotic conflict, with no clear sense of how the day would end. But in the face of such adversity, I witnessed something remarkable. Under Grant's leadership, we rallied. His calmness in the face of chaos was a balm to us all. While others faltered, Grant pressed on. It was a hard-fought battle, but by the end of the second day, we had secured the victory. The Confederates had been pushed back, and the Union had claimed a decisive win. But the cost was staggering. Over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. It was a grim reminder of the high price of war. In the aftermath of Shiloh, I took stock of what had happened. The Union had won, but it had come at a terrible cost. We had learned that the war would not be won quickly or easily. We had to be prepared for the long haul, and there was no turning back. The experience at Shiloh solidified something in me. The realization that war was not about glory or honor, but about survival and strategic execution. It was a lesson that would serve me well in the years to come. That year, 1862, marked a turning point in the war for me. The initial optimism and patriotic fervor of 1861 had given way to a more sobering reality. I had seen firsthand the brutality of combat, the massive loss of life, and the grim determination required to keep moving forward. The war was no longer a distant concept. It was now personal. The stakes were higher than ever. The Union needed men who were willing to take command, to make difficult decisions, and to lead their soldiers through the fire. For me, the early part of the war was about proving myself, not just to my superiors, but to myself. The doubts that had plagued me during my time in civilian life began to fade as I embraced my role as a leader. The battlefield, I realized, was where I belonged, and with every victory and every loss, I grew more determined to see the Union through to the end, no matter the cost. The year 1862 marked a turning point in my military career, one that would shape my role in the Civil War and eventually bring me to the forefront of the Union Army. After the victory at Shiloh, I could sense the momentum shifting in our favor, though the path ahead would remain filled with obstacles. The war, in its early stages, had proven to be an unpredictable and brutal affair, with the Union forces often struggling to establish a cohesive strategy. But beneath the chaos, I could see the potential for victory. If we could just maintain discipline, make the right moves, and bring order to the storm. One of the key moments that propelled me forward during this period came after the Union's success at Shiloh. I was placed in command of the District of Memphis, which was responsible for securing the Mississippi River Valley. This was a strategic assignment, one that required not just military skill, but a firm understanding of the geography and the importance of the river itself. The Mississippi was the lifeblood of the South, and if we could control it, we would cut off a major supply route for the Confederacy. I knew the significance of this mission. It was my chance to prove myself, to show that I had the ability to lead a large-scale operation. But the task was not without its difficulties. The Confederates were formidable in the region, and the terrain was challenging, especially in the swampy areas and along the riverbanks. There was a constant threat of ambush, and my soldiers were often engaged in skirmishes and small battles with no clear resolution in sight. I would quickly learn that success in the West would be determined by patience, strategy, and the ability to capitalize on any weaknesses in the Confederate defenses. As I took command in Memphis, I knew the stakes were high. The pressure to succeed was enormous. But despite the challenges, I found myself energized. I was given a great deal of autonomy, and I began to develop a strategy that focused on securing key points along the river and preventing Confederate reinforcements from reaching our lines. In my mind, this was the way forward, securing the Mississippi River and creating a stronghold that would give us the upper hand. There was no time to waste. The Confederacy's control of the river was a critical advantage that we needed to diminish. One of my first major operations was the capture of the crucial Confederate fortifications along the Mississippi River. Though I faced some setbacks, including logistical challenges and the occasional resistance from local Confederate sympathizers, I succeeded in tightening our hold on the region. It wasn't a moment of resounding glory, but it was a steady accumulation of small victories that slowly turned the tide. As the Union forces gained ground, I could feel the confidence building within our ranks. The Union cause had been marred by so many early defeats, but now, slowly, we were taking control. My rising success in the West caught the attention of General Ulysses S. Grant, and in 1863 I was given a crucial role in the next phase of the Union strategy, the campaign to seize the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. This city was the heart of Confederate operations along the Mississippi River, and its capture would effectively divide the Confederacy in two. The importance of this campaign could not be overstated. I knew that if we could take Vicksburg, we would gain control of the Mississippi River and deal a devastating blow to the Confederacy. The battle for Vicksburg was one of the most difficult and defining moments of my career. From the outset, it became clear that the city's location, high on a bluff above the river, made it an almost impregnable fortress. The Confederates had fortified the position with trenches, artillery, and well-prepared defenses. Grant and I knew that a direct assault would be suicidal. Instead, we decided to lay siege to the city, cutting off all supply lines and waiting for the Confederates to be forced into submission. It was a strategy that required immense patience and discipline. The residents of Vicksburg, along with the Confederate soldiers, were trapped, unable to resupply or escape. And as the days wore on, we could see the toll it was taking. Starvation, disease, and constant bombardment began to wear down the defenders. I remembered a grim sense of inevitability that hung in the air. It was a siege that lasted for weeks, and we had to contend with the harsh conditions ourselves, the summer heat, the endless hours of trench warfare, and the knowledge that we were engaged in a brutal war of attrition. But we remained resolute. We knew that the city's fall was only a matter of time. And on July 4th, 1863, after 47 days of siege, Vicksburg finally surrendered to Union forces. It was a moment of triumph, one that I will never forget. The victory not only gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, but also proved that we were capable of defeating the Confederacy in key strategic locations. For me, the fall of Vicksburg represented more than just a military victory. It was the culmination of all the lessons I had learned throughout my career. The patience required in the siege, the ability to adapt to the ever-changing conditions of warfare, and the focus on a larger strategic goal. These were the qualities that defined my approach to leadership. I had risen from a general with little more than hope and experience to one who understood the complexity of warfare and the importance of seizing opportunities when they arose. My leadership had played a key role in this victory, and the recognition I received reinforced my belief that I was on the right path. But victory at Vicksburg also marked a transition. By now, the war was moving into a new phase. It was no longer just about winning battles, but about shaping the future of the Union. The Confederacy was not going to surrender easily. The battles ahead would be even harder, the stakes higher. The strategy had to evolve. The war would demand everything from us, from Grant, from me, from every soldier in the Union Army. But after Vicksburg, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The tide had turned in our favor, and I was prepared to see this war through to the end. After the victory at Vicksburg, the momentum was clearly on the Union side, but there was still much work to be done. The Confederacy, though divided and under siege, was far from broken. We had gained control of the Mississippi River, but the heart of the South still beat strong. I could feel the pressure mounting. Every day the Union forces had to continue pressing forward, pushing the Confederate forces further back. It was a war of attrition, one where we had to maintain constant pressure, never allowing the enemy to catch its breath. It was clear that we would need a new strategy, one that didn't just defeat the Confederate armies, but also demoralize the Southern population, cutting off their will to fight. The year 1863 had been a defining one in the West, but by 1864 the war had spread across the entire South, and the Union's objectives had shifted. I was promoted to command the military division of the Mississippi, which included overseeing operations in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia. This was an enormous responsibility, and I knew that the success or failure of my campaign would have far-reaching consequences for the Union's war effort. At the time, Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies, and he put his full trust in me to lead a crucial campaign in the South. Grant's focus, now that he was overseeing all Union armies, was to apply relentless pressure on the Confederate forces from all directions, with the goal of breaking their spirit and ability to continue the war. His strategy was clear. We were to wage total war. Total war was a concept that had been evolving throughout the conflict, but it was in 1864 that it truly took shape. It wasn't just about fighting the enemy's armies, it was about breaking their will to resist. We were not only going to target military objectives, but also the infrastructure and resources that the South relied on to sustain the war effort. This was a strategy that would bring the horrors of war to every doorstep, not just those on the battlefield. The civilians, too, would feel the weight of the conflict, and it was something that weighed heavily on my conscience. But I understood that, in the end, this was the only way to break the Confederacy, to cut off their supplies, destroy their means of communication, and leave them with nothing but the ruin of their own war effort. Grant's decision to appoint me for the campaign in Georgia, which would ultimately lead to the Battle of Atlanta, felt like a challenge and a responsibility that I had to embrace. Atlanta was a crucial Confederate stronghold, both militarily and symbolically. It was an industrial hub, vital to the South's war effort, and its loss would strike a deep blow to Confederate morale. But capturing Atlanta would not be easy. The Confederates, under General Joseph E. Johnston, had built strong defensive positions around the city, and they were determined to hold it at all costs. The task of capturing the city, which would serve as a base for further operations into the heart of the South, was monumental. I was prepared for a fight that would test every ounce of my skill and resolve. In the summer of 1864, I began my push toward Atlanta. The first weeks were a series of skirmishes and cautious maneuvers as I sought to outflank Johnston's forces and bring them into battle on favorable terms. But the Confederates were skilled at defending their positions, and every attempt I made to turn them back was met with strong resistance. Johnston's army proved difficult to defeat in a straightforward engagement, and for several months I found myself bogged down in a war of attrition. The stalemate continued, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but neither able to deliver a decisive blow. At the heart of the campaign, there was one constant: the burning need to outmaneuver the enemy. The Confederate forces, though they put up a good fight, were stretched thin, and their ability to supply their troops was increasingly limited. At the same time, I was slowly cutting off their supply lines, limiting their ability to reinforce or resupply their positions. The war was no longer about grandiose charges or glory on the battlefield. It was about strategy and logistics, about wearing the enemy down until they had no more resources to fight with. In July, General Johnston was replaced by General John Bell Hood, a more aggressive commander who would prove far more difficult to handle. Hood's tactics were direct, often reckless, but they forced us into several bloody engagements. I remember the Battle of Peachtree Creek, which was one of the most intense clashes of the campaign. Hood's forces attacked with fury, attempting to break through our lines, but we held firm. The fighting was brutal, and the casualties were high on both sides. Still, we prevailed, and the Confederates were pushed back once again. But it was not just the military engagement that defined my campaign. It was the relentless march of my forces through Georgia. In late 1864, after our victory in Atlanta, I was given the green light by General Grant to execute what would become the most famous and controversial military campaign of my career, the March to the Sea. The idea behind the March to the Sea was simple, though the execution was anything but. I was tasked with cutting a path of destruction through Georgia, from Atlanta to the port city of Savannah. The goal was to cripple the Confederate war effort by destroying everything in our path: factories, railroads, crops, and anything that could be used to sustain the enemy. It was a total war strategy taken to its extreme, and it would have consequences not just for the Confederate military, but for the civilian population as well. As we marched, the destruction we left behind was immense. We cut railroads, burned crops, and destroyed infrastructure. The devastation was widespread, and it left many Southerners homeless and hungry. But I knew that this was necessary. We couldn't afford to leave any room for the Confederacy to regroup. This campaign, while harsh, was designed to send a clear message. The South could not continue this war indefinitely. Their resources were finite, and I intended to make sure they were used up. By the time we reached Savannah in December 1864, I had achieved what I set out to do. We had captured the city, and we had delivered a major blow to the South's ability to continue fighting. The morale of the Confederacy was shaken, and the Union had gained a significant strategic advantage. But even as I celebrated the victory, I was aware of the cost. The destruction I had caused would take years to rebuild, and the lives affected by my actions were a constant reminder of the harsh realities of war. The march to the sea marked a turning point in the conflict. The Confederacy was no longer capable of sustaining its war effort as it had in the past. The pressure we had applied to their economy, infrastructure, and morale was undeniable. And as I stood in Savannah looking out at the city we had taken, I knew that the Union was closer than ever to achieving victory. As the year 1865 dawned, I knew the war was nearing its end, but there was still much to be done. The Confederacy, though battered and broken in many places, had not yet surrendered. The last vestiges of the Confederate Army were still holding out in the Carolinas, and the final chapters of the Civil War would demand even more of us than the years before. I had seen war in its most brutal forms, but nothing compared to the last stages of this terrible conflict. It was a time of exhaustion, of relentless pressure, and of witnessing the toll that years of war had taken on both soldiers and civilians. After my march to the sea, I had left a trail of devastation stretching across Georgia, but the Confederacy was far from finished. General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were still entrenched in the east, and Confederate forces in the Carolinas under General Joseph E. Johnston were retreating southward, trying desperately to regroup. Our goal now was to drive home the final blow, to apply pressure from every direction and push the Confederates to the point of collapse. By early 1865, I had received orders from General Grant to take command of Union forces in the Carolinas. Our goal was clear: destroy the last remaining Confederate armies in the South and bring the war to a final, decisive conclusion. At this point, the idea of a negotiated peace was out of the question. The Confederacy had rejected every opportunity for reconciliation, and their leaders remained determined to fight on. The Union had to finish what it had started: total victory. I led my forces through the Carolinas, continuing the strategy that had proven successful in Georgia. This time, however, the path was more treacherous. The landscape was different, the people more resentful, and the Confederate resistance more desperate. The troops I commanded were battle-hardened, but even they could sense that the end was near. There was a weariness in the air, a feeling that we had crossed the point of no return. The Confederacy could not survive much longer, but its people and soldiers still fought with the remnants of their old determination. We continued our march through South Carolina, a state that held a special significance to the Confederacy. It was here that the war had begun, after all, with the attack on Fort Sumter in 1861. As we advanced, we encountered fierce resistance from Confederate forces, especially at places like Columbia, the state capital. Yet, as we pressed forward, we saw how the spirit of the South had been broken. The civilians, once proud and defiant, now fled before our advancing columns, and the Confederate soldiers, weary and demoralized, were no longer able to put up the same kind of resistance they had in years past. By March 1865, after several battles and skirmishes, we had reached the heart of North Carolina. But despite our progress, Lee's army remained formidable in Virginia, and the situation was still fluid. General Grant, who had been relentlessly pursuing Lee's forces, was now closing in on him near Petersburg and Richmond. The end was inevitable, but it was still a matter of timing, strategy, and sheer force of will. Then, in early April, after months of pursuit and fighting, the moment arrived. The final surrender of General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, was the moment I had waited for. I remember the feeling of both relief and sadness as I heard the news. Relief because it was finally over, but sadness because of the enormous cost, the loss of so many lives, the destruction of so many families, the terrible toll on both sides. The surrender marked the end of the Confederacy, and it sealed the fate of the South. It was, in many ways, the end of an era for both the North and the South. The surrender of Lee was followed by the collapse of the rest of the Confederate resistance. Johnston's army in North Carolina, the last significant Confederate force in the field, continued to retreat, but it, too, was forced to surrender. On April 26, 1865, Johnston laid down his arms, and the Confederate Army ceased to exist as a military force. The war was officially over. The Confederacy had been defeated. I stood at the end of this long and grueling journey, reflecting on all that had transpired, the pain of the years of war, the suffering of the soldiers, the destruction of entire cities, and the loss of so many lives. It all came rushing back to me. The scale of the conflict had been beyond anything I had imagined when I first took up arms in 1861. But I also recognized that the Union had been preserved, and the ideals upon which this country had been founded were safe for future generations. The war had been a crucible, and we had emerged from it stronger, though deeply scarred. But the end of the war was not the end of my challenges. In the aftermath of Appomattox, I found myself once again tasked with maintaining order and stability in a country that had been irrevocably changed. The South was in ruins, its economy shattered, its infrastructure destroyed. The process of reconstruction would be long and difficult, and it was one that would require an entirely new form of leadership. Leadership that would bridge the gap between a war-weary North and a devastated South. As I made my way back to Washington, I reflected on the years of conflict that had defined my life. The triumphs, the defeats, the lessons learned on the battlefield, and the toll taken on my own spirit. It was all part of the journey. I had entered the war as a man of uncertain purpose, struggling with doubts and frustrations, but I left it as a seasoned military leader, having played a pivotal role in one of the most significant conflicts in American history. The war's end brought relief, but it also ushered in new challenges. The task of rebuilding the nation, of healing the wounds of war, would require strength and wisdom. I was not sure what the future held, but I knew that the same principles that had guided me in war, determination, resilience, and a commitment to the greater good, would be just as important in the years to come. The war was over, but the work of rebuilding and moving forward had just begun. The war was finally over, but the real work was just beginning. As the smoke cleared and the last echoes of battle faded, I found myself caught between the sense of relief at the Union's victory and the deep knowledge of the long road ahead. The Confederacy had been defeated, but the nation was not yet whole. The scars of war ran deep, not just in the land, but in the hearts of those who had fought and lived through it. The question now was not only how to rebuild the South, but also how to bring a fractured country back together, to restore the fabric of a nation torn apart by years of bloody conflict. I had spent most of the past 4 years in the trenches of war, living and breathing the relentless grind of battle. The military had been my focus, my purpose, and I had seen it through to the end. But now, as the nation entered the period of Reconstruction, I found myself faced with a new challenge, one that required a different kind of leadership. No longer was it enough to outmaneuver the enemy on the battlefield. Now, I had to navigate the complex political and social realities of a country in the midst of healing from its most devastating conflict. In the months following the surrender, I was promoted to the position of Commanding General of the United States Army, a role that would define much of my post-war career. This was not the kind of role I had ever envisioned for myself. I had never been a politician or a master of diplomacy, and the task of overseeing the Army during such a tumultuous period was daunting. My experience had been in war, not in the delicate art of rebuilding a fractured nation. But the responsibility was mine, and I took it on with the same determination that had guided me throughout the war. Reconstruction was proving to be a difficult and contentious process. The Southern states, after years of rebellion, were now tasked with rejoining the Union. The issue of slavery had been resolved, but the question of how to integrate 4 million freed African Americans into American society remained a volatile issue. The South was in economic ruins, its infrastructure destroyed, its cities devastated. At the same time, the freedmen had no land, no resources, and little opportunity for a better future. The challenges were enormous, and I was well aware that there was no easy solution. In my role as Commanding General, I was called upon to help maintain order and stability in the South. My military background and the respect I had earned during the war made me a key figure in this effort. I oversaw the occupation of Southern states, helping to enforce the policies of Reconstruction, including the provision of land to freedmen and the establishment of civil rights protections. But I also saw firsthand the resistance from many Southern whites, who were unwilling to accept the new social order. The violence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan made it clear just how deeply ingrained the culture of white supremacy was in the South. The task of integrating the formerly enslaved population into the social and political fabric of the nation was proving to be even harder than I had anticipated. Despite the challenges, I believed that the Union's victory had to mean more than just the preservation of the United States as a political entity. It had to signal a profound change in the nation's moral and social fabric. The war had been fought to preserve the Union, but it had also been fought to end the scourge of slavery. The promise of freedom and equality was not just a military victory, it was the beginning of a new chapter in American history. I was determined to see that promise fulfilled, but I understood that the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. In 1868, I was appointed as the president of the Louisiana State University, a position I took on as a way to contribute to the rebuilding of the South in a more constructive manner. Education, I believed, was one of the keys to creating a more enlightened and progressive society in the post-war South. But my time in academia was short-lived. The call to public service beckoned again, and in 1871 I was appointed as the General of the Army once more, this time under President Ulysses S. Grant. As I resumed my role as Commanding General of the Army, the nation was entering a period of relative peace, but the struggles of Reconstruction continued. The Southern states, still recovering from the war, were grappling with issues of race, land, and civil rights. Meanwhile, the Western frontier was still a source of tension, with Native American tribes resisting the expansion of American settlements. It was a time of transition, a time when the country was grappling with the implications of its victory and what it meant for the future. During my tenure as Commanding General, I focused on several key issues, including the continued effort to protect Native American lands and the military's role in supporting the federal government's policies in the West. It was a role that put me at odds with some of the more aggressive expansionist policies that sought to displace Native peoples. I came to view the Indian Wars with a heavy heart. I understood the necessity of preserving the peace in the West, but I also felt deeply troubled by the suffering of the Native American populations. The military's role in this process was something I often questioned, but I carried out my duties with the same sense of responsibility that had guided me throughout my career. As the years passed, my role as Commanding General of the Army continued to evolve. The challenges of the post-war period slowly gave way to the complex issues of a growing nation. The economy, industrialization, and the rise of new political movements all shaped the country in ways that I could hardly have anticipated when I first began my military career. In 1884, after more than 2 decades of military service, I retired from the Army. The decision to retire was not one I took lightly, but by this point I had seen enough of the trials of military life. The war was behind me, and the country had moved into a new era. I had lived through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the challenges of rebuilding the country. It had been a life of duty, sacrifice, and at times, pain. But it was also a life of purpose. In my retirement, I moved into a life of reflection. I wrote my memoirs, trying to make sense of the chaos and sacrifice that had defined my life. I spent time with my family, and I watched as the nation I had fought so hard to preserve continued to grow and change. The echoes of the war still resonated in my mind, but I saw that the country was healing. The nation had learned many hard lessons, and though there was still much work to be done, I had hope for the future. When I look back on the years that followed the war, I realized that my life was defined not just by the battles I fought, but by the choices I made in the aftermath. The lessons of the war were not just military ones, they were moral ones too. I had fought to preserve the Union, to bring an end to slavery, and to secure the principles of liberty and equality. The war was over, but the work of ensuring those ideals for future generations would never truly end. As I lived out my final years, I found comfort in the knowledge that I had done my part in shaping the nation. The country was not perfect, and the scars of the war would never fade completely. But in my heart, I knew that the sacrifices made during the war had brought the country closer to its true ideals, and that, I believed, was a victory in itself.